Greetings, Thelemites. So, I'm taking another break from working on my book. I'm about a third of the way done through editing, which is good. I'm on track for getting it done in October, doing a chapter on Zekar van Adkar, who is apparently a lot of people's favorite character thus far. But I thought I'd take a break and do another quiz, this time the political compass test. It's been a while since I did one of these. The last time I did one, I got somewhere in the lower right-hand corner here, in what would be the conservative libertarian section. We'll see what I get this time. I imagine that I've probably shifted closer towards the center, at least on the left-right axis, which I don't even really like the left-right axis. I don't think it's particularly accurate, but that's the way that this test is set up. If anything, I've probably shifted more towards libertarianism rather than less. Upward would be authoritarianism, so sort of upper left here would be like Ocasio-Cortez. Upper right would be like Richard Spencer. Lower left would be like Sargon of Akkad, Tim Pool, people like that. And then lower right would be, as I said, conservative libertarians. So let's see what we get. If economic globalization is inevitable, it should primarily serve humanity rather than the interests of transnational corporations. Well, I'm not particularly in favor of globalization, but if it's inevitable, then yes, it should serve humanity rather than the interests of transnational corporations. I'd always support my country, whether it was right or wrong. No. No one chooses his or her country of birth, so it's foolish to be proud of it. Mildly disagree. You can be proud of the things that your country has done. Whether you are or not is another story. Also the fact that you can change what country you move to, so just because the country happens to be the one that you're born into doesn't mean that you're necessarily stuck with it. It's not foolish to be proud of it. I think it's foolish to be proud of it without reason. Our race has many superior qualities compared with other races. Well, given that as part of my persona, I've pretty much given up my identity, including race, I am going to strongly disagree with that. Because race as a whole doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what other people who look like you do. That has nothing to do with them being of that race, and it has nothing to do with whether you have any particular superior qualities or not. Now, in a medical sense, you could say things like certain races tend to have a predisposition for different kinds of disease or physical and cognitive abilities, but as I'm an individualist, I don't necessarily view the world through a racial lens. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Most of the time, yes. Military action that defies international law is sometimes justified. Sometimes. Not that international law is necessarily always good and correct. So the UN, for instance, could be a terrible law. There is now a worrying fusion of information and entertainment. I wouldn't necessarily call it worrying. In fact, within my work, I try to fuse information and entertainment because entertainment is persuasive, and it allows you to seed information in a way that makes that information more palatable. So I would strongly disagree with that. In fact, since the last election, politics, in my opinion, has become quite entertaining to watch. I know a lot of people think that it's scary and the world is going to hell, and I can certainly sympathize with that, but if you're not one of those people, you're probably having the time of your life right now. Okay, next page. Now the economy. We're talking attitudes here, not the something stock exchange index. FT. Not sure what FT stands for. Now the economy. We're talking attitudes, not the... Scratch that one too. Now the economy. We're talking attitudes here, not the free trade stock exchange index. Is that what that stands for? I don't do a lot of stock trading, so... People are ultimately divided more by class than by nationality. It's kind of a false dichotomy. Because there are a lot of people within, say, America who are poor who don't necessarily find solidarity with other poor people in other countries such as Africa. In fact, the poor in America are pretty much within the 1% in terms of global wealth. So I would say disagree. Nationality usually tends to bind people more than class. Controlling inflation is more important than controlling unemployment. Strongly agree, because inflation is the result of mostly overprinting money and various manipulations by government and the central bank of the money supply, and that leads to diluting of the currency, which leads to loss of purchasing power. And so even if you don't have a job but you still have money, if you can control inflation, you'll be able to buy the same amount of goods and services for that money, whereas if you're unemployed and inflation goes up, now you're in an even worse position. Even if you're unemployed and getting welfare, for instance, the fact of having inflation means that your welfare dollars purchase that much less. So controlling inflation is definitely way more important. And you can be unemployed and get charity, but even if you are employed, inflation just robs you of your purchasing power and your savings. Because corporations cannot be trusted to voluntarily protect the environment, they require regulation. Well, why can corporations not be trusted to voluntarily protect the environment? I would put that onus on the consumer. So, for instance, there's a documentary called Walmart, The High Cost of Low Prices, where one of the things that they talk about is the environmental damage that Walmart does as a result of their shitty business practices. In fact, that was one of the main reasons why I decided I would never work at Walmart and I would never patronize them with my money unless I absolutely had no other choice and was practically starving. So I feel that people don't use the free market and its mechanisms as much as they should. And so they turn to the government to try and fix the problem for them because they don't want to put their money where their mouth is and do the hard work to keep corporations accountable themselves, which you could very easily do if you can imagine if everybody just decided at once to stop buying from Walmart. that would be a huge financial loss from them, and they'd have to take stock of what it is that they're doing and why, and launch a full investigation, and hopefully they'd be able to realize through polling and so forth that the reason for it was because they were damaging the environment, or whatever other practices that they're doing. So, for instance, Walmart, I wrote a whole article about this on my blog, how Walmart was caught engaged in actual literal slavery, not the, $8 an hour minimum wage is slavery, but actual literal chattel slavery, I believe. And so every time I go to Walmart, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, do I really need whatever this is? Is it worth justifying enabling of slavery? And the answer is usually no. As I said, every once in a while, when you're in a desperate situation, I can understand, but most people, I don't think, care as much as they claim that they do, and they're just looking for an easy out. I would say strongly disagree. From each according to his ability to each according to his need is a fundamentally good idea. Fundamentally, yes. However, in practice, the way that it works, if it's done through coercive government redistribution, is a terrible, terrible idea. But in principle, you could imagine in a free and voluntary society, or even in your own family, for instance, everybody contributes what they can for the betterment of the whole. So fundamentally, it's a good idea. I just don't think government should be the one to do it. It's a sad reflection on our society that something as basic as drinking water is now a bottled, branded consumer product. No, because what most people don't understand with this particular issue, especially out in California with this whole Nestle scandal at the same time that there's a drought, what you're paying for is not so much the water as the service of bottling it and making it portable. So water may be abundant, but just because it's abundant doesn't necessarily mean it's potable or portable. So somebody has to come along and expend labor and capital in making it accessible to you, and that's essentially what you're paying for. So no, strongly disagree. The fact that it's basic is why it costs so little, why it only costs, say, $1 for a bottle of water. You can imagine 100 years ago, for instance, where people had very brackish, toxic water. And in fact, in certain parts of the world, poor sanitation and lack of drinking water is one of the major causes of disease. In fact, that was the case throughout most of the world up until very recently. Land shouldn't be a commodity to be bought and sold. Okay, so here again, this is where my training in law allows me to have a different understanding of what land is versus what the common person thinks land is. Most people think of land as being the dirt. In a legal sense, what land is actually a three-dimensional space defined by the borders of whatever your land is, going all the way up to the sky and all the way down to effectively the center of the earth. So what land is in a legal sense is just the right to use and occupy a particular geometric space, and to use the fruits of whatever objects happen to be on it. So you can buy and sell your rights. You can buy and sell commodities. So, strongly disagree. It is regrettable that many personal fortunes are made by people who simply manipulate money and contribute nothing to their society. Yes, like central bankers and people who solicit the government for free money, whether that be corporate bailouts or personal social welfare. That's very regrettable that many of them make money off of that. So this is one thing that annoys me as a libertarian, is people make this false dichotomy wherein they say just because I'm opposed to social welfare, they think that somehow means I'm in favor of corporations getting all this money and of having defense spending be through the roof in the trillions of dollars. In reality, I can be against both of those things at the same time. It's not an either or, and I wish more people would realize. Sometimes necessary in trade. You can think about the America First principle as being a form of protectionism. Protectionism is also one of the main things that led to the American Civil War. So protectionism can be very bad at times, but whether it can be good, I would say that as a libertarian working from the bottom up, you would want to, you can think of protectionism as even applying to something like the mantra buy locally. So if you're suggesting people buy locally or buy from, say, organic farmers, for instance, that's a form of protectionism. Now, it's not state-enforced protectionism, which is what I think they mean here. I don't necessarily think that the government should be involved in dictating who you buy from. But at the same time, we have things like trade regulations and tariffs and sanctions that are other forms of protection. You can think about making it illegal to buy lead-based paint from China or something. I'm going to tepidly agree with that. The only social responsibility of a company should be to deliver a profit to its shareholders. Well, that's the only legal responsibility that a company has. As far as social responsibility, there is something called social entrepreneurship, and any businessman or woman who doesn't take into account the way that their business practices affect the greater society is not going to be in business for very long, at least if people are using the free market properly and care about the issues that they claim they care about, because they'll just run that company out of business. You can think about BP when they had that massive oil spill in the Gulf. I, for one, completely boycotted buying from BP as a result of that. I know a lot of other people did. So being socially responsible is something that a company should take into account. So I'm going to say only social responsibility, disagree. In fact, strongly disagree. To them what their responsibility should be, so, which is probably how that'll get interpreted, so disagree. The rich are too highly taxed. Well, interesting thing about that, if you go to Learn Liberty, there are a number of videos on that channel that talk about this issue, and they go through and show how not only are the rich too highly taxed, but that, number one, they're the only ones who effectively pay any taxes when you account for the fact that people get money back from the government in the form of welfare. They're the only ones that really have money anyway, because they're the ones that mostly make all the money to begin with. There's that saying, I never took a job from a poor person, for instance. So the rich are the ones that create all the jobs because they have all the money to pay people. When I say all, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit. Obviously, poor people buy things too. We're just talking about a proportion. Going back to Learn Liberty, there are other videos on there that talk about how when you account for tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, it doesn't matter what the actual effective tax rate is. the government still collects the same percentage of revenue. So decreasing taxes actually stimulates the economy, leading to a bigger pie, and thus a bigger slice. So strongly agree that the rich are too highly taxed. Now, anytime that I make this argument, people always come back at me and say like, oh, well, you hate the poor. It's like, no, I'm against taxes on anybody. I don't believe that just because you have a certain amount of money in your bank account that suddenly things like morality and property rights change. I believe in applying principles consistently to all people, regardless of what class they're in. That means that rich and poor both have social responsibilities and ethics that they have to apply to, and it also means that they have rights that have to be respected. I think Steve Jobs made a quip at one point about someone was suggesting he pay higher taxes, that he wasn't paying his fair share, and he said he created Apple and how many billions of dollars worth of economic activity and how many jobs he created, plus all their amazing products. And he's like, what more do you want from me at that point? And I think most people, if they're being honest with themselves, would agree with that people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates contribute incredible amounts to not just the economy, but to society as a whole. And, obviously, Elon Musk would be another good example of that. In fact, Elon Musk offered to help with the hurricane in Puerto Rico, giving people batteries. So just because you're rich doesn't necessarily mean that you stole your money from other people, which is the main argument that people put forward for why we need to tax them more, because they're not paying their fair share, which is just bullshit. There are other ways to contribute to society, and in fact, them having so much money is a measure of their having contributed that much to society, because of what money is. Money is simply a measure of what society owes you. Moving on, those with the ability to pay should have access to higher standards of medical care. I strongly agree. Now I'm going to get shit for this as well, saying like, oh, well, you don't care about the poor, you want them to die in the streets and blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, as someone who personally is very health conscious and whose family is very health conscious, let me tell you that healthcare is not a right. And in fact, most people, when they talk about so-called healthcare, are only really talking about health insurance and how they're going to pay for healthcare. Very little attention is actually given to the care part. If they were, they'd be more focused on, say, holistic medicine, prevention, eating healthy, organic foods, and things like that, instead of stuffing their faces with McDonald's and whining about fat shaming and so forth. Right, so the ability to pay for higher standards of medical care. The ability to pay for standards of anything is just a basic fact of life. Money is a form of power. Those with more power have more access to things. That's just the way that the world works. You don't have to like it, but it doesn't mean that you have the right to then demand that other people give their services for free just because you can't afford it. Imagine if we treated everything like this. If a restaurant, for instance, was forced to give food to everybody regardless of their ability to pay, we would very quickly realize that the restaurant would go out of business. So those who have more should have access to higher care, better products in general. In fact, they're being able to and willing to pay for more expensive versions of things initially is what leads to companies getting more capital to bring down the costs of things through R&D. You can think about computers and cell phones, for instance. The laptop that I'm using right now has as much computing power, if not more, than the entire lunar lander module that landed on the moon in the 1960s. That cost several $billion. My laptop costs less than $300. You can get a decent smartphone for as little as $99 in some cases if it's an older model. Whereas in the 80s, when they first started coming out, it would cost about 10 grand for one of those bricks that only worked about half the time and didn't work at all if you were on, say, a mountain or in a tunnel. But because you had wealthy people who were willing to pay that money up front, the costs were able to come down and it improves the quality of life for everybody. Governments should penalize businesses that mislead the public. Well, fraud is a common law malum in se crime, so yes, if you commit fraud, you should be punished. A genuine free market requires restriction on the ability of predator multinationals to create monopolies. That is the exact opposite definition of a free market. In fact, a truly free market would not have any sort of government restriction at all. And I would argue that we have not had a true free market since 1913. 1913 was the year that the Federal Reserve was put into place. I believe that's also the same year that the income tax was put into place. Prior to that, we still had an army, a navy, the Marines, roads, schools, medical care that was the best in the world at the time. So the argument that we need higher taxes to pay for things is just bullshit. The other argument here is that they're talking about predatory monopolies. Well, the government itself is a predatory monopoly, and a violent one at that. So if you're against violent monopolies, you should be against government having more power. Whereas most monopolies that would arise under a free market would be voluntary in nature. They would also not necessarily be coercive. Now, I understand that includes some shady, nefarious stuff such as corporate espionage, and maybe they don't necessarily, as discussed before, uphold the best ethical practices, but in terms of having the government come in and just break them up, I don't agree that that should be a thing. Plus, it also depends on the company, doesn't it? So, would anyone be adverse to giving Elon Musk's companies more power, or Amazon, or Apple, or anything like that? So just because you're a monopoly doesn't necessarily mean that you're predatory. That's sort of that's another false assumption. So I'm going to strongly disagree with that one. The freer the market, the freer the people. Strongly agree, because if you're not free to spend your money how you want, then you're not really free. Now, obviously, you can't spend it on things like hiring an assassin or creating libel. Those are already common law crimes, but that's not what they're referring to here. Now we'll look at your personal social values. So, as a libertarian, I'm generally socially liberal and economically conservative. A lot of my answers will probably tend to be left of center on this. Abortion, when the woman's life is not threatened, should always be illegal. Disagree. I wrote 2 whole articles on this subject, talking about abortion. You can go and read through that if you want to know more about that, and what my particular view of that is. Now, I don't like abortion. I think we should do everything that we can to avoid having to put women in that situation. But to say that it should always be illegal, you can think about, and the example I use in my blog is, if a woman somehow finds out that she got pregnant the second after conception happened, and she took the morning after pill and terminated it, she technically committed abortion, but did she do anything that is necessarily immoral? No, I don't think she did. And if you do think that, then you have to make the argument as for why that cluster of cells in that particular moment necessarily has any sort of value or right to life. And in the article, I go through and explain essentially where I think better milestones for determining that philosophically would be. Again, you can go and read that. I'll put a link to it in the description. All authority should be questioned. Yes. All authority should be questioned. All authority should not necessarily be obeyed or disobeyed. You have the right to question authority. Whether you should obey that authority or not depends on its legitimacy. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Strongly agree. As Ra's al Ghul says in Batman Begins, justice is balance. You burnt my house and left me for dead. Consider us equal. And I talk extensively about this, both online and in my book, about this concept that justice is balance, and that the only way to restore true justice is to make the punishment fit the crime. Now, in law, there's something called equity, which is essentially a form of mercy, where you try and take the higher road and you forego true justice and execution on the law in exchange for some sort of arguably more humane punishment, such as putting someone in prison instead of just straight up murdering or castrating them. You can make the argument that makes for a better society, but in terms of actual true justice, that's not what justice is. Taxpayers should be expected to prop up any theaters or museums that cannot survive on a commercial basis. Strongly disagree. Now, I am actually an author and an artist, and I went to art school and graduated from art school. And I can tell you as a content creator that it would actually offend and disgust me if I had to, if the way that I could make any money off of my products was to essentially take blood money, which is what taxes are, to take blood money from my fellow human beings, and that wouldn't speak very much of the quality of my work. Which, if it was quality, theoretically, I should be able to survive and make it last on a commercial basis. The fact that we have things like the national endowments for the arts and so forth, I actually supported Trump in his decision to defund those, things like PBS and so forth. I think all those, if they are truly good and necessary, can survive through voluntary charity donations. You don't necessarily have to put guns to people's heads and extract money to pay for them. If people really care about them, and again, this is the main economic argument here, is that if people really care about all these issues, they'll put their money where their mouth is instead of turning to Big Brother to go and pay for stuff and force people to do things for them. So, strongly disagree with that. Taxes should never be used to support the arts. And in fact, if you read the note that I put in the very beginning of my book, I explain a little bit more about my reasons behind that. I would recommend that you take a look at that. That's enough on that for now. Schools should not make classroom attendance compulsory. Strongly agree. So I have been to private school, I have been to public school, I have been to college, to trade school, and I've learned things for free online or for very little cost online, such as through Khan Academy, Coursera, Masterclass, Udemy, and so forth. Having been through all of those, I can tell you with certainty that We don't need the government to be involved in education at all. We don't need taxes to go towards education. In fact, if and when I have kids, I plan on homeschooling them myself. Most anything of value that I have learned, and I went to some good schools in my time, so it's not like I went to shitty schools. I went to decent schools all throughout my academic career. But even having said that, most of the truly valuable things that I've learned, I've either learned through personal experience, from working in a job, from talking to other people, or from getting it online, again, either for free or very little cost. So I would say get the government out of schools altogether. Not everybody is necessarily going to benefit from that either, because just from genetic and cultural differences in temperament and IQ and so forth, one size doesn't fit all. Different people learn in different ways. All people have their rights, but all people have their rights, period. All people have their rights, for all of us, that different sorts of people should keep to their own kind. Fuck. Depends on what kinds of people we're talking about. Are we talking about people that, say, have radical, regressive religious beliefs that they claim gives them justification for murder? Because I don't think those people should be interacting with the rest of society. Is this talking about segregation? Is it talking about border control? Because immigration is not a right. Immigration is a privilege for the same reason that it's not a right for you to be able to come on to property without money. I think in a national sense, the people of that particular country have the right to exclude anyone for any reason that they don't want to come into their country. But then at the same time, you have things like government-enforced segregation, which is obviously terrible. Is better for all of us at different kinds. See, it's not necessarily saying that the government splits people up, it's just asking if it's better in general, which I would tepidly agree with. In fact, people self-segregate all the time along various lines. Bathrooms, for instance, in universities, you're seeing actually reverse segregation, where before you had governments in Jim Crow laws enforcing mandatory racial segregation with different facilities for blacks and whites. Now you have social justice warriors calling for white people to stay home for days of like black recognition or whatever the hell that's all about. In a social sense, I would say yes. People have the right to freedom of, you know what? People have the right to, all people have their rights, and among those rights is freedom of association and freedom of disassociation. So yes, it is better for some of us to have the ability to segregate, as long as it's not government-enforced segregation. Good parents sometimes have to spank their children. Hard disagree. Watch Stefan Molyneux. You'll understand why. It's natural for children to keep some secrets from their parents. Is it natural for them to keep secrets? I mean, if they have a good relationship with their parents that's open and honest and trusting and doesn't involve them being physically abused, that I wouldn't see any reason why they would keep secrets from their parents, but just a sort of human nature. We don't always tell everyone everything. So, disagree? Possessing marijuana for personal use should not be a criminal offense. Strongly agree. And the war on drugs. I cannot wait for Governor Murphy to finally legalize marijuana here. He should have done that day one. Further talking about marijuana, so the war on drugs is actually one issue that I disagree with Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions on. So in my other quiz, I said that I was a sometimes Trumper. This would be one example of an issue where I strongly disagree with their particular policy. Now, to his credit, Donald Trump is not necessarily cracking down hard on marijuana, even though he's the, quote, law and order guy, and even though Jeff Sessions is the, quote, law and order guy, they don't seem to be prioritizing marijuana prosecution. And Donald Trump has actually called lots of attention to the opioid crisis, which is more of a medical, mental health, and physical health issue. So even though he personally is a teetotaler and talks a big game when it comes to the war on drugs, he has paid lip service to the idea of legalizing it. I don't know why no one has put it to him that places like Colorado create a lot of jobs and make a lot of money for that. It would also go a long way towards healing race relations if he were to legalize it. So that's one area that I strongly disagree with Donald Trump on. The prime function of schooling should be to equip the future generation in jobs. Disagree. While I do think that teaching people marketable skills is important, the prime function of schooling should be to educate people about various things. There are plenty of endeavors that don't necessarily involve marketable skills, but which are important to learn. Although I do think that you should also teach your kids to be able to pay their own way and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So if by schooling we don't necessarily just mean formal education systems, but like your parents teaching you things, I guess I could see my way to agreeing with that. People with serious inheritable disabilities should not be allowed to reproduce. I don't like the way that question is worded. Should not be allowed to reproduce. So there's a policy going on right now in, I believe it's Iceland, which is also enacted in parts of the UK, if I'm not mistaken, where babies who have Down syndrome are effectively aborted or terminated. From what I understand, I've talked to people who work in the medical profession. Down syndrome is a very serious, crippling disease that you basically don't have. Well, some people can live with it, many people do, but by and large your life is going to be miserable with certain of these diseases if they're quite serious. I think people should be allowed to make that choice for themselves, whether they want to live such a life or not. I'm not entirely sure what I would do in that situation. If, say, it was my kid that I discovered had a particularly crippling disease, I would almost be tempted to call it mercy. But at the same time, as a transhumanist, eventually we're going to develop technology that will fix all of these things. So it comes down largely to timing, honestly, and quality of life, and just how serious the disease is. I mean, the fact that it's inheritable, just because it's inheritable doesn't mean it can't be cured eventually. Somebody who has an inheritable disease like that might willfully voluntarily decide they don't want to have children, and I would be accepting of their decision. People with STDs, for instance, that get passed on to their kids. At the same time, it's hard to argue with the fact that if it's a genetic disease, eliminating that entire gene pool does effectively eliminate the disease. It's this should not be allowed part, because that just smacks of eugenics in the negative sense, in the Nazi sense, which is obviously terrible. So I'm going to strongly disagree on that basis. If you want to do it voluntarily of your own accord, that's fine. You have my blessing. If you want to try and force it on somebody else, I can't agree with that. The most important thing for children to learn is to accept discipline. Discipline is important. Do I think it's the most important thing? No. There are no savage and uncivilized people. There are only different cultures. Strongly disagree. Look up Sargon of Akkad's series, All Cultures Are Beautiful, for examples of ones that are not. For instance, in, I believe it's Pakistan, there are certain tribes that when a woman gets raped, the court essentially punishes her by further raping her, sometimes raping her to death. That is obviously savage, uncivilized, and barbaric, and is not merely a different culture, it is a reprehensible culture. So this idea that all cultures are equal and beautiful and valid, it just is completely divorced from any sort of notion of civility or morality. Those who are able to work and refuse the opportunity should not expect society's support. Strongly agree. If you can work and refuse to do so, you're just a lazy bum. That doesn't mean you can't change or that we won't help you out if you decide to reform your behavior, but as a famous Democrat politician once said, you are entitled to nothing. When you are troubled, it's better not to think about it, but to keep busy with more cheerful things. Strongly agree. Fake it till you make it. What you think about, you bring about. If you dwell on negativity, you're just going to attract more negativity to you. Whereas if you focus on being productive and think positively, you'll eventually work your way through whatever it is that's bothering you. First-generation immigrants can never be fully integrated within their new country. Strongly disagree on never, because, say, someone from England moves to America, obviously the cultures are similar enough that they could very easily integrate, especially if they're young when they do it. Now, some immigrants genuinely never fully integrate, but to say that they can't ever do it is just incorrect. What's good for the most successful corporations is always ultimately good for all of us. Strongly disagree for the use of always. No broadcasting institution, however independent its content, should receive public funding. Strongly agree. Taxation is theft. Also, by receiving public funding, it perverts incentives and actually makes them less independent, because you don't bite the hand that feeds you. If you're receiving money from the government, you are less likely to criticize the government. We saw this with PBS and the National Broadcasting Association, and again, going back to the notion of things like funding for the arts. A lot of the people that were upset by this were not themselves artists, or were shitty artists who otherwise couldn't hack it with their skills in the market. And a lot of them were just looking for free money. So by broadcasting institution, you can also think it's essentially a marketplace of ideas, really. You can think about YouTubers who basically put out content for free online. Maybe they get support through Patreon or advertising or stuff, but they don't get government funding, unlike a lot of these major mainstream media players in the media political complex. And ironically, a lot of the independent broadcasters do a lot better. And I think a large part of that is precisely because they are beholden to their customers, not to the will and whim of government. Our civil liberties are being exclusively curbed in the name of counterterrorism. Yes. Things like the Patriot Act, for instance, the war on terror. Obviously terrorism is a problem, but as Thomas Jefferson said, I would rather live and deal with the problems that come with an excess of liberty than with an excess of government or something along those lines. So, strongly agree. It's better to have freedom than security. As Ben Franklin said, whoever would trade liberty for security deserves neither. So, if we had a properly enforced Second Amendment where everybody was allowed to carry whatever weapons we wanted, terrorism wouldn't necessarily be as big of a problem. You're seeing a rise in terrorism and crime in general in the UK, for instance, because they're not allowed to carry weapons in most cases. In fact, London is stripping people of their right to even carry things like knives, and I think Scotland arrested somebody for possession of a potato peeler, which is just absolutely ridiculous. None of those policies are doing anything to deter crime and terrorism. It's just creating criminals out of otherwise decent, law-abiding people. A significant advantage of a one-party state is that it avoids all the arguments that delay progress in a democratically political system. Well, that is definitely an advantage, but it also comes with problems of its own. So I'm going to disagree with that. So one of the arguments that might actually delay progress in a democratic political system is the idea that other parties are not being heard and their own progressive ideas, whatever your definition of progress might be, are not being heard. Generally, I don't like the word democrat or democracy or democratic. It's essentially mob rule, two wolves and a sheep voting on dinner. In fact, there's a meme where you have, I think it's like 4 or 5 guys all standing around, and one of them goes, I vote that we execute Bob, all in favor, and all but Bob raises their hand, and then says all opposed, and only Bob raises his hand. And then the next panel you see, he's hanging from a tree, and the one guy says to the other, in some cultures, they don't even get the right to vote. Oh, how barbaric. So democracy is a 4-letter word. I detest anybody that uses it. I prefer the term republic, because republic still incorporates the idea that you have a say in your system while also still protecting your rights even against the tyranny of the majority. So having a one-party system is just absolutely terrible in general. Although the electronic age makes official surveillance easier, only wrongdoers need to be worried. Strongly disagree. This is one of the reasons why I got rid of I didn't get rid of my Facebook account, but I stopped using it, stopped posting to it. I still post occasionally to my personal one in dealing with family and friends and Messenger, but I don't post any personal information on there, especially after what happened with the the massive data collection that went on. For all we know, that information could be used by our own government or foreign actors for whatever various nefarious purposes, even just social engineering and trying to control your lives. We already have a little bit of that being a problem with social media algorithms, for instance. It tends to create a bubble wherein it reinforces things that you already like and agree with. So that's another reason why I also take active steps to try and listen to people from both sides of the aisle. So I'll listen to Sargon of Akkad, but I'll also listen to Anita Sarkeesian. I'll listen to, say, Tim Pool and Scott Adams, who are on the left, but I'll listen to Stefan Molyneux and Ben Shapiro on the right to try and get both sides of whatever arguments. In general, it's better to just listen to as many different sides of as many different arguments as you can to avoid that kind of echo chamber. But yeah, surveillance is only going to get worse. In fact, as cameras get smaller, as AI gets more advanced, eventually it's going to reach a limit where it's practically mind reading. It already almost is, and that's not even accounting for things like actual CIA levels of mind reading, which may or may not exist. One of my teachers talked about how he himself was followed around by a number of government agents, and he had them turn on some kind of device that allowed them to speak directly into his mind. And he's somebody who was fairly knowledgeable, and I would trust his opinion on this. So his view of it was he didn't really care that they were doing that, because his argument was, well, if they can read your thoughts, they have to at least consider them, and why would I go around thinking and saying and doing anything that somebody would find objectionable? Now, to some extent, I definitely agree with that, and I don't post anything online that would make it easy for anybody to use against me, but at the same time, you also still need to protect yourself, because people make mistakes, and even a simple mistake, as we're finding out in the age of Twitter, with all these mobs of people going after someone for some slip-up that they made 10 years ago and destroying their careers over it. It's not just wrongdoers that need to be worried, it's everybody, because we live in a very unforgiving society, unfortunately, and it can really ruin you, even just government aside. We just need to be willing to be more understanding and forgiving of people that express opinions that we don't like. The death penalty should be an option for the most serious crimes. I strongly agree. As I said before, justice is balance, and the only thing that can really equal a life is another life. So if you're a serial mass murderer, for instance, I don't see why taxpayers should necessarily pay to keep you alive when a bullet to your head will do just as well. If you're a serial child rapist, for instance, probably better off that you eat a bullet as well. Now, again, obviously there are people that are falsely accused and found guilty when in fact they're innocent, sort of a Shawshank Redemption scenario. I definitely believe that a higher level of due process is required when meting out the death penalty, and that the standard for determining guilt should be a lot higher when you're determining whether somebody should receive the death penalty. But just in principle, both from a financial perspective and a social, not social justice, but a social perspective and a justice sense, it makes sense that some people simply deserve to die for their crimes. Again, going back to what I said before about forgiveness, I do think that we should try and give people a path of redemption whenever possible, but some people, let's be honest, are just simply never going to repent, and putting them in jail for the rest of their lives is actually going to make them worse, not better. So, again, for certain of the most serious crimes, especially when you have people who order executions through organized crime and gangs and terrorism, it's just better overall that those people eat a bullet. In a civilized society, one must always have people above to be obeyed and people below to be commanded. I don't like the way that this question is necessarily worded, but in principle, this is essentially the idea of dharma as expressed in Hinduism, where everybody has their proper place in society. If you believe in karma, for instance, as I do, everybody has a say in the way that their life turns out upon incarnation. So, for whatever reason, whether it's to learn a moral lesson or for role-playing purposes or whatever, I do believe that you have a say in what your so-called character, quote-unquote, becomes when you incarnate. So some of those people will necessarily be higher, some will be lower, some will be leaders who should be obeyed. I don't necessarily know that they always have to be obeyed. And some people just are not natural-born leaders and are followers. And again, I don't like the way that this question is particularly worded, but hopefully I've contextualized it such that you'll understand why I would strongly agree. Again, I don't think that the government should be the one to necessarily come in and tell you that that's the way it should be. That's probably going to tick me up a little bit towards authoritarianism, honestly, so we'll put agree. Abstract art that doesn't represent anything shouldn't be considered art at all. Well, as somebody who has a degree in fine arts, who has actually studied contemporary art and modern art, I can tell you that there are different classifications of abstract art and modern art. Some of it is more valuable than others. Certain things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being particularly aesthetic do have value for their social or emotional impact. Installation art is a good example of that. What constitutes art is a very subjective and personal idea. I mean, there are certain standards and rules that people within that field who are professionals and critics apply. I have my own opinions on that as well. But then obviously there are certain things that should not be considered art, just vomiting on a page, painting with your period blood, I don't think should be considered art. That's just gross. So I'm going to agree. And that's my professional opinion. In criminal justice, punishment should be more important than rehabilitation. Yes. Both of these are important, but the primary role of punishment is to protect society as a whole. So if you have a mass murderer, for instance, the reason that you arrest them and throw them in jail is to prevent them from causing further harm to anyone else. That is a form of punishment. Punishment usually is its own form of rehabilitation, although I do think that our system definitely needs to be overhauled in favor of rehabilitation, because otherwise you're just going to create worse criminals. I forget who it was that said that criminals go to jail to become as a form of graduate school, something along those lines. But the primary purpose is to punish bad behavior and to detain them and protect the greater society from them. So that should be more important, but rehabilitation is also important. It is a waste of time to try and rehabilitate some criminals. Okay, so I already explained this. Some criminals obviously are beyond rehabilitation, even though it's generally a good idea to try and rehabilitate them whenever possible. But some, the only thing you can do is put a bullet in them. In fact, you look at the terror cells that are forming in the UK as a perfect example. These are people who committed crimes and acts of terror and got thrown in jail, and while they were in jail, they recruited more people, and when those people got out, they were completely unrepentant and just went and recruited more people and committed further acts of terrorism. They do this all the time. Gangs do this all the time. Whereas if you just put bullets in those people, you're going to stop a whole lot of future crimes. Obviously, due process, it's all messy and icky, and people don't like that, but reality is harsh sometimes. Some criminals definitely are beyond rehabilitation. I don't personally claim to be the sole arbiter of who is or isn't, but I think most reasonable people can draw a line around those that can and those that can't. The business person and the manufacturer are more important than the writer and the artist. Well, given my chosen profession, I would strongly disagree with that. Both are equally necessary, I would say. Mothers may have careers, but their first duty is to be a homemaker. Well, their first duty, if they're mothers, is to their children. Homemaking, I would hazard a guess, is part and parcel of that. Obviously, they may have careers. No one's suggesting that we return to pre-civil rights era where they couldn't have jobs. But I would argue that whether you're a mother or a father, if you have children, taking care of them should be your first duty. So yes, maybe part of the reason why you go and get a job is to take care of them. But there's nothing wrong with being a homemaker. Regardless of what feminists will tell you, it's not disempowering. Some people actually find greater joy and happiness in it. I'm not going to suggest that being a homemaker and a stay-at-home mom is for everybody. Obviously, again, you can have careers. Many people can do both successfully. But again, your first duty is to your children if you're a parent. Multinational companies are unethically exploiting the plant genetic resources of developing countries. Is this talking about like Monsanto or something? I don't understand this question. We're talking about invasive species. I mean, people aren't necessarily going over and stealing cocoa from Morocco or anything like that, as far as I'm concerned. The plant genetic resources. I'm going to disagree, just because I don't know what this means. I do think that genetically modified organisms and companies such as Monsanto definitely fuck with the environment and exploit countries. Whether they exploit the genetic plant resources, they can certainly fuck with the genetic resources. I guess if that's what they're referring to, then I would strongly agree. Of developing countries. Because here's the thing, at the same time, as much as I don't like, and I say this as a transhumanist, I don't like genetically modified organisms. I don't think that they're healthy or safe. I don't think that they're things that we necessarily evolved to eat. So, for instance, human beings didn't evolve to eat wheat. But over the course of tens of thousands of years of eating it, we sort of developed a tolerance for it. So from what I understand, one of the reasons for the rise in gluten sensitivity and celiac disease is probably because we've been genetically modifying wheat to be something other than what we were quote unquote naturally evolved to eat. And the fact that that happens at an exponential rate, whereas our bodies evolve slowly over time, it's really tampering with a lot of things. But then at the same time, you have places where, like parts of Africa and China, where, eating genetically modified rice, the so-called golden rice, for instance, is better than starving to death. I think eating non-GMO foods is something of a privilege at this point, even though it shouldn't be, even though we have the resources and technology and farming practices where if we just applied them properly and intelligently, we could feed the entire populace. And then there's all the legal battles that you hear about corporations like Monsanto coming in and destroying farmers' lives because the wind blew their seeds onto their crops and they didn't know any better and they just planted them, and then some shady company came in and did test samples and they're like, oh, look, we found our crops on your lawn, and so you owe us a bunch of money for stealing our patented product, which is complete bullshit. I think the way that GMOs are dealt with should be reversed of what they are now. So if I were one of those farmers, I would actually countersue a company like Monsanto for nuisance, because if they're going to claim their crops are their property, then that makes them liable for it. And so if their crops are being blown onto other people's properties, that's creating a public nuisance, and they're responsible for that, and the farmer could actually sue them for damages for that. I don't know that anyone has necessarily successfully done this, but in principle, that's how it should work. Because if you're going to claim this as your property, you need to keep better control of it. I think GMOs should be put into environmentally quarantined zones, the way that marijuana is created, and have marijuana grow freely. All that said, multinational corporations are unethically exploiting the plant genetic resource. Yeah, I'm going to strongly agree with that. I talked myself into it. Making peace with the establishment is an important aspect of maturity. As somebody who's all for making peace with people that you disagree with, making peace with the establishment. I do think that there's a right way and a wrong way to interact with the establishment. So, for instance, I don't subscribe to the violent, belligerent activities of, say, Antifa, for instance. But at the same time, there is a time and place for revolution. In fact, the entire history of America was birthed in that same spirit of violent revolution and rebellion against an unlawful authority. However, they did try everything in their power to make peace beforehand. And it's just that the king was tyrannical and the establishment wouldn't make peace with them, essentially. So I'm going to strongly agree with this on the basis that you should try and make peace with the establishment as best as you can, while keeping in mind that the establishment is not always going to make peace with you. And when it doesn't, this is like what Stefan Molyneux always says about the first time that I meet someone, I try to be as nice to them as possible, and then after that, I treat them the same way that they treat me. Try to make peace with the establishment, and then treat the establishment the way that it treats you afterwards. If you can get your reform passed in a peaceful manner through, say, legislation or raising social awareness, peaceful protesting, things like that, that's obviously better than violent insurrection, and is definitely an aspect of maturity. So, I wouldn't say that people like Antifa are mature by any stretch of the imagination. So, hopefully that clarifies that. If you got through that okay, you'll find these propositions on religion a breeze. Astrology accurately explains many things. As somebody who subscribes to astrotheology and is a practitioner of divination, there are certain things that astrology explains and certain things that it doesn't. I explained this in one of my blog posts. I think that the best way to view astrology is less to do with the star position having an effect on your energy levels, although there may be something to that. It's more sort of like psychological personality typing. So through epigenetics, your environment will affect your physiology and development. So somebody born in the dead of winter, for instance, like me, a Pisces, is going to have a different psychology and physiology to somebody who's born in the heat of summer. And astrology, if you want to think about it in this sense, is simply the empirical observation of these patterns and classifications over time, that certain people born at certain times of the year tend to exhibit certain traits. So in that sense, I think a lot of people probably do feel that the conclusions drawn from astrology, at least a good portion of the time, explain things accurately. So yes. There's also a lot of bullshit in astrology, though. So you cannot be moral without being religious. Strongly disagree. Stefan Molyneux is somebody who is very moral, who is not religious. In fact, in my inspiration gallery is marked with morality. So that's that. That said, I do think that religion can be useful for instilling morality in a good number of people who otherwise don't have it. But you can be moral without it. Many atheists are. Stefan Molyneux, Sam Harris, Armored Skeptic, and so forth. Charity is better than Social Security as a means of helping the genuinely disadvantaged. Strongly agree. Social Security is a Ponzi scheme and a fraud and needs to be opposed. I don't care that you paid into it. You paid into a Ponzi scheme as well, and that's tragic, and you deserve to be compensated, but not at the cost of taxpayers who weren't the ones that defrauded you. I blame FDR for foisting this shitty program on us. Some people are naturally unlucky. That's a very good question. I'm going to agree. Some people are naturally unlucky. Well, a good portion of luck comes down to circumstances, but also psychology. A good portion of your circumstances and psychology are dictated by nature rather than your own choices. So in that sense, yes. It is important that my child's school instills religious values. Depends what you mean by religious values. So I went to a religious school for 9 to 12 years in the beginning of my academic career, and we definitely learned religious values, but I also learned to grow out of them and to study religions comparatively when I was in high school and college. I mean, if you're tying religious values to moral values, it's obviously important to instill children with moral values and to cultivate their having a relationship with God and spirituality. I do think that's important. Calling it religious values, I don't like that term because it smacks of institutionalism, so I'm going to strongly disagree. Finally, a look at sex. Well, that should have been your first one, and you would have gotten more people to take this test if it was talking about sex. Sex outside of marriage is usually immoral. Strongly disagree. I don't think I need to explain that one. Same-sex couple in a stable, loving relationship should not be excluded from the possibility of child adoption. Strongly agree. Again, I don't think I should have to explain that one. You know, if there are plenty of single parents who are perfectly capable of raising healthy children, there are plenty of opposite-sex parents who raise shitty children. You know, the quality of the parent should matter more than their gender. Pornography depicting consenting adults should be legal for adult population. Strongly agree. In fact, one of the things that the Nazis did upon rising to power was they completely purged Berlin of all of its, debauchery and hedonism and pornography. They persecuted many Jewish people for being actors and directors and promoters of pornography, and that's just completely terrible. Say what you will about the effects of pornography on society in a social sense, but in a legal sense, people should be allowed to do what they want. Same goes for prostitution as well. What goes on in a private bedroom between consenting adults is no business of the state. As long as it's not pedophilia, yes, strongly agree. No one can feel naturally homosexual, strongly disagree. There are many species of animals that exhibit homosexual behavior, and so obviously that's not down to choice or morality. It's the fact that heterosexuality is completely genetically determined should tell you that homosexuality is also completely genetically determined. Now, whether a person chooses to engage in particular behaviors that are heterosexual or homosexual, that's a bit more complicated. But as far as naturally feeling homosexual, that's perfectly legitimate. These days, openness about sex has gone too far. I would argue just the opposite. We're not open enough about sex, at least in terms of talking about it. Do I think so? I don't necessarily like LGBT pride parades where it's basically people dressed up in bondage gear walking down the streets alongside children. That's a bit disturbing. But I mean, people don't necessarily have to go and watch that. Just because I support your parade doesn't mean I want to be invited to be a part of it. The fact that we don't talk about sex enough, particularly in the wake of the Me Too movement, I think is very troubling. I think if people were more open and honest about it, we wouldn't see the breakdown in sexual relations that we are right now. In fact, I wrote an entire article about this, talking about the breakdown of sexual relations between specifically men and women. It's more complex for LGBT people. They have their own problems, but within the wider heterosexual context, I think that we're going to see a future in which people tend more towards sex robots for a variety of reasons. So I think we need to still be more open about it. We've definitely made great strides since the sexual revolution and since the civil rights movement. I don't think we need to go back to the temperance era on that issue. So that's it for that. Let's see how we did. You can read through that if you want. Your political compass. Okay. So economic left-right, 1.5. Social libertarian authoritarianism, minus 1.9. So right about there. I think previously I was somewhere around this area, down here. So definitely getting a lot closer to true central. I may have even been over here, I'm not sure. Sargon is somewhere over here, I think, if I remember from his political compass. You don't want to be too far to either side. You definitely don't want to be anywhere above this line, in my opinion. People further down, part of this comes down to the wording of the question as well. And also the fact that you're forced to provide essentially a yes-no answer to a lot of these. Some people that are way the hell down here, anarchists, for instance, I have my disagreements with them. But generally, to be somewhere in, I would say, this general region here, about this line to about this line, and then from here to about here is, in my opinion, the most rational place you want to be in, which is where most people probably fall if they're not extremists. So that's my political compass test, and hopefully you enjoyed that.